Hey guys, how are we doing? So for the past 4 weeks, we have been talking about instruments of the orchestra, and that of the orchestra bit is going to be kind of important today. We talked about orchestral strings, and those are instruments like the violin, viola, cello, bass, and also the harp. Instruments that are acoustic, which means that they produce their own sound and they produce it loud enough that an audience can hear them. Then we moved on to the percussion family, and even though we only got kind of a glimpse at all the instruments that go into that family, we got to see kind of how they work, that we have to shake them, hit them, or cause them to vibrate in some way to get them to make their sound. We then moved on to 2 weeks of wind instruments, and that's any instrument at all that you have to blow into if you want it to make sound. We saw that the brass, the first family we looked at of winds, and the woodwind, even though they both use air to create vibration and sound, they do it in a completely different way. Brass forces the user to make the vibration, to buzz their lips, and the instrument amplifies it, which means to make louder. That's another word that's going to come back to us in a few minutes. Woodwind instruments use all kinds of different ways, but the primary way we looked at was using a reed, a little piece of wood that vibrates against the mouthpiece and creates the sound that way. And then we use either valves or keys to change that sound. So the family we're looking at today is actually part of a family we already looked at. We talked about 5 string instruments that belong in the orchestra, but there are a lot of string instruments that don't make their way to the orchestra. One is right here. Now, at first glance, it might look like just a teeny guitar, but this is a ukulele. It's traditionally a Hawaiian instrument, and even though it looks like a guitar, there are a couple differences. Number 1, it doesn't have 6 strings. You can tell from the tuners that it only has 4. Number 2, and you can't tell this from the video, those strings are not made of metal. They're actually made of nylon. Okay? And because of that, they're going to make a very, very different sound, a little bit of a warmer sound than metal. But also, it doesn't kind of cut through the sound quite as much. I'm going to adjust a little bit so you can see better. One of the other differences between guitar and ukulele is there's no strap. I have to kind of hold this up by myself, and the way I do that is I usually just kind of pin it down with my forearm and hold it in place with my left hand, what I'm going to use to fret. Now, you can play melodies on this thing like you just heard, but it's more common to play chords on this thing as accompaniment, kind of like this. The more we get together, 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 the more we get together, the happier we'll be. And, you know, so on and so forth, okay? Lots of different chords and harmonies and all sorts of things you can play on ukulele, okay? Now, this is also an acoustic instrument. It's loud enough that you could play it with a group without having to plug it in or anything like that, without having to stick a microphone in its face. So the next instrument I want to talk about is an electric instrument, okay? Now, this one right here is actually a version of the bass we saw a few weeks ago. This is an electric bass guitar. Now, the biggest kind of thing we want to see about this is by itself, you probably can't hear much, if anything, right now. It's very, very quiet. In order to get it to sound, we have to turn on an amplifier. And you can see one right behind me, and I'll talk more in a minute about what exactly that does. Now, we have talked about how different string instruments all kind of work the same. The strings vibrate, it goes to the bridge, which we have right here, and then the bridge sends the sound into the body where it bounces around and comes out the resonating chamber. Problem there. The body on this instrument is not big enough for the sound to bounce around, and there is also no resonating chamber. Instead of that, we have these things right here. One here, another one right here. It's kind of blended in well. I don't know if you can see that one. These are called pickups because they pick up the sound and they send an electrical signal through this cord that's plugged into the bass guitar and out to the amplifier, and that's what's going to make this thing, assuming we turn it on, that's what's going to make this thing sound. Now, most of the time, the way we play this is by walking our fingers, these two fingers right here, on the different strings and kind of plucking them a little bit to get a sound. And it gives us kind of a softer, more blended sound. If we want kind of a punchy, in-your-face sound, we're going to use a pick like we would with a guitar and get something like this. Okay. Now, that works well for pop, it works well for rock. If you're going to play, say, country or a jazz, you probably want to go with that two-finger approach to be able to play a little bit more graceful, a little bit more subdued, a little softer. Okay? Now, another way, and even though this is not my strongest way of playing, it's a lot of fun to do, is called slap bass. And with slap bass, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of use the bass to mimic a drum set. Now, if you remember a few weeks ago, drum set had a lot of different components, but the two main ones were the bass drum on the floor and the snare drum right in front of us. The bass drum gives us the lower sound, boom, boom, and the snare drum gives us a little bit of a higher sound. Now, in slap bass, we're going to use these two strings, the two at the top of the bass, to be our low end, our bass drum. We're going to use the higher sounding strings to be our snare drum. And we don't play like this. Instead, we're going to bring the thumb in on this one. And what we do is we kind of use the side of our thumb to slap the strings, which is why we call it slap bass. Okay? Now, you could just kind of play bass lines like that. But what kind of really gives this thing its power is rotating back and forth between them and trying to kind of mimic a drum beat. So the basic way to play it is we go bass drum, and then we go to that snap up top, okay? And we don't just pluck the string like we saw before. What we do is we actually grab the string and let it snap back. So if we go back and forth between that, we get a bass line that sounds kind of like this. Has a lot of beat to it, a lot of groove to it. Not super interesting though. The way we make it a little more interesting is by adding things a little bit at a time. So here's what happens if I add one more thumb hit. Better. And I can kind of bring it full circle and give it a more finished sound by adding just one more note to it. Much better. Almost has that ring of a finished bass line now. So the thing I can do to really, make it sound less like an exercise and more like a song is I can move that hand position to play some different chords. And what adds to that even more is if I put a little speed, if I increase the tempo a little bit. All right, like I said, not my strongest suit, but a whole lot of fun to learn how to do. The last thing I want to share with you is probably the thing you're most excited about. I'm going to flip on that one behind me, and we're going to talk a little bit about electric guitar. Now, we don't need to talk too much about how it works, because it actually works exactly like the electric bass. Here's our pickups, and there's actually 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, on this one, and it sends the signal out a cord at the bottom to that amplifier behind me. Now, when we first turn this thing on, our amplifier is usually set to something called clean. And clean is going to sound a lot like acoustic guitar, sounding like this. That kind of echoey sound you hear is called reverb, and it's one thing that even playing clean adds to electric guitar, makes it a little bit different than acoustic. If we were going to play chords, like which is typically what you hear me do in class, they're going to sound a little bit fuzzier than usual, but you can still kind of hear them changing in the background. Yeah, and if you recognize that, that's actually the beginning of our golden rule song. Now, the setting I'm going to change to right now is called distortion, okay? Now, what distortion does is, if you imagine turning up the volume on something, imagine, don't actually do it. If you turn it up too loud, the sound gets very fuzzy. It's not as clean, it doesn't sound as good. Distortion is basically what happens when we do that, but in a controlled way. Somebody figured out how to mimic the sound of a guitar being fuzzy and kind of overblown, and basically turn it into what we probably think of as rock and roll guitar. So when we play a chord like that, it's a whole lot more, well, rock and roll. And there's lots of things we can do with chords. But if we play single melody notes as well, we get kind of an interesting sound with that distortion on. And then, of course, we've got up high is a whole lot more interesting. Alrighty, guys. I'm going to clock out on this one. I am glad I got to share some more instruments that don't typically make their way into the orchestra, and I hope you had fun kind of listening to them a little bit and just seeing the types of things that they can do. All right, guys, I will see you next week. Bye-bye.